America has always been divided. The idea of a United States was always hypothetical. The fight over states' rights is at the foundation, violating the unity of our country. Some states can have this, other states can have that. Some states have high incomes, some states are very poor. Some have more resources, some have more assholes. Every vote counts equally until we get to the Electoral College. That's when voting is exposed for the sham that it is. Let me say I'm a huge advocate of voting. As a matter of fact, not voting is a big no-no for me. It's the literal least one can do for living somewhere among other people. But at the same time, that's only as strong as our regulated society. The more we allow corruption to exist, the less and less our votes count. Then, before long, leaders are decided in boardrooms and elections are just for show. The people, the workers, manipulated to believe they have a choice amidst the gladiator sport, reality show, never-ending for-profit news and campaign spending cycle. Then, whoever's turn it is takes the throne and the drama is played out for we the people like a wrestling ring circus for entertainment purposes only. Like we can see them kicking their opponent in the face, and then the opponent really sells it like he got kicked in the face, right when the camera cuts to a different angle, so we just go with it rather than rewind and pause to see the opponent's hands were in front of his face and push the guy's feet away. Voting is what we must do because the minute we stop voting out of protest, they don't stop ruling. They just look at each other and say, well, why bother with voting anyway if people don't want to participate? But we must understand the institutional issues with our system, and the primary issue is that the power is centralized out of the hands of we the people and into the hands of the most dangerous and unregulated of our society, the wealthy business sector. Which leads me to Citizens United. This episode is kind of about that, but I'm really looking at one specific moment in history where the wealthiest of the wealthy in America knew their gravy train was about to derail, and they cashed in all their chips, bet the house, and went for broke. This story is the Citizens United prequel, folks. However, this is a true tale of turmoil, treason, infidelity, and insurrection. In Coup, Catch You, I'm breaking down another little lost nugget from history that helps put into perspective, how did we get here? That question has plagued us all season, so let's inch a little closer to the white light at the end of our little rabbit hole to understand just how the American working class was sold up the river nearly a century ago, and how the wealthiest resource hoarders in the world conspired together to overthrow the American government. Fascism in America is nothing new, my friends. This story explores the unbalanced power dynamic, the fears of the 1%, and why we've all struggled for so long. The world watched the last one unfold live on television. This is the story of the 20th century's corporate, capitalist, fascist insurrection that would have been had it not been thwarted by an unlikely hero. And welcome to the podcast. You'd think someone whose entire platform is built on deconstructing toxicity in our society and in our culture would know better than to use problematic cliches in his intro. Did I? Well, the idiom I used when I said America's working class was sold up the river is much different than what I should have said, that America's working class was sold down the river. That's a very racist term, hearkening back to America's original sin. Slavery or unconscionable capitalism, you chicken and egg that one. Being sold down the river implies that a human being has been exchanged for financial compensation and then put on a boat to go farther south to work and be kept like livestock. Being sold up the river is different. It's a northern saying that's more steeped in organized crime culture, specifically New York, New Jersey, where if someone betrayed you or ratted you out, you'd be sold up the river to a prison like Sing Sing. What's happened in this unloved boat Willy Wonka psychedelic pleasure cruise is we've been taken for a ride, folks. Like slaves, sold down the river, and like prisoners, sold up the river. Back and forth, the American working class has been sold out to the highest bidder, and we, the people, ultimately let it happen. Pastor Martin Niemöller's post-Holocaust poem, Then They Came, brings out a lot of what I'm talking about. My own updated, Americanized tribute to that, Speak Out by Sir Talks-A-Lot, available on iTunes and Spotify, is about this crucial moment in history that other nations have seen before. Why didn't we learn? We've been sold out, so we won't stand up, rise up, and toss the power players out on their asses. When I talked about elections, who do you know who can afford to be a politician today? The system is broken, rigged against us. And the last time someone was saying that on the debate stage, their party conspired to shut them down and decided the candidate for the people, stoking a centuries-old resentment, reigniting unresolved frustrations, reopening decades and decades of old wounds. What 2016 was an attempted mandate against capitalism run amok. When your every value and principle, freedom and liberty, right and privilege, is built on the foundation of money and greed, what did we think was going to happen? When Bernie Sanders was the candidate with momentum, we heard threats from corporations of blowback and retribution if he won, threats of layoffs, relocations, rising prices and inflation, shutdowns. Every time the working class starts to have a voice, the boot of oppression is lowered on our necks. One might argue, as fake and fluid as our world's currencies and economies are, it's all controllable. So on some level, every time the American people struggle with inflation, gas prices, or debt, fill in the blank, there's an underlying motivation behind that by those who manipulate those markets and control the money. We often see corporate profits surge in times of crisis, too often. When inflation is making it hard to keep our head above water, someone is cashing out with those extra inflation incentives and shrinkflation incentives. When we begin to pursue alternate forms of energy, the oil industry squeezes their influence like a python. The same as the NRA, telecom, tobacco, pharma, alcohol, now cannabis, since those others can't keep them out anymore. It certainly is us versus them, friends. But the us isn't a race, religion, national heritage, culture, gender, sexuality, political party, etc. It's we, the people, versus the wealthiest of the wealthy, the 1%. What if I told you America has been at each other's throats since day one? There is no unity and never has been. You probably wouldn't be the least bit surprised. The fault line division and the blame game played throughout our short existence as a nation has been obvious to everyone else in the world, even if not ourselves. This division in America is layered like a Dante's Inferno lasagna of suffering. In there, we have all the oppressive institutions this country and others have thrived on. Racism, misogyny, sexuality, xenophobia, gender, religion, nationalism. It's really deep. It's a thick lasagna. And the more divisions, the more divided we, the people, are. The less we notice when the ship is rocking, because we're rocking right along with it. America's story is being one against the other. In the beginning, it was the revolutionaries and the crown loyalists, those colonials who still wanted to be England, Federalists and anti-Federalists, slavers and abolitionists, Unionists and secessionists, Americans and Confederates. After that, American capitalism really began to blossom into its own, sputtering, struggling, and all-out failing at times. But by the early 20th century, the establishment's benefits and privileges of supremacy were laid at the feet of white, straight Christian males. When we look at history, America's history of bigotry, not just racism, we can see that anyone who hasn't been this has been persecuted. Immigrants, women, Italians, Jews, Catholics, anyone a shade darker than me. In a different context, one of early 20th century Europe, that sounds quite Aryan, huh? Let's not wave that flag just yet. But later in another episode, I will be discussing eugenics and America's obsession with perfection, the kind that a certain mustachioed monster admired but couldn't achieve himself. Sadly, the parallels between the two countries are alarming and appalling, especially now. I'm going to give you a great big spoiler for not only this episode, but for this entire series. Whether anyone wants to admit it, whether anyone wants it, fascism. The characteristics of fascism are appealing to certain types of people. People who seek power and seek to hold and grow that power. In a greed-based society like free market capitalism run amok, as we see in America, everyone is just a number, and there is a value placed on us, our compliance, our lives. Those who cost more than they contribute are looked down on, valued less, dead weight, baggage. Those who have less and will never attain more regarded as the lowest of the low-class citizens. One almost needs the digitized individual to just be anything but human, even just a number. How can we deny insurance benefits and force a family into bankruptcy? It's financially beneficial for the company to do so. This sort of experience is not unique to a single identifying checkbox on the diversity form. This happens to people who look like me too. This is classism. The wealthy simply walk in, get whatever they want, never need to consider the cost. They don't have to, even when it comes to healthcare and education. In America, it doesn't matter if you are the best or can be the best. It just matters that you have the most. This is the division in America. This is the root of white supremacy, the patriarchy, the toxic white nationalism. America is divided, almost on mythological levels. Those Isaac and Ishmael, Osiris and Seth, Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel, brothers till the end, stories of turmoil and tragedy. And the story's details change, they vary, the similarities kind of skew from one side to the other, sure, but that's just the way human communication works, right? The telephone game? One might argue these were at one point the same story, spun off into different parables, fables, stories with a lesson to learn. Aesop at its finest. In fact, what we see today is America's own divide as clear as day. Brother against brother, the better brother, privileged and protected. The lesser brother, a rapscallion who always has his hand out. The better brother given all the power when mommy and daddy left. Now, one might argue the better brother ousted the parents and took the power. Then the lesser brother never seems to be able to make it on his own, having to serve at the behest of the better brother. The lesser brother, always struggling under the oppressive weight of existence, while the better brother enjoys the rewards of all that struggle. The lesser brother, if given enough time to consider it and the privilege of relaxation, might begin to ask, why is the better brother better? It isn't long after one questions the very rules and constructs under which they exist, only to realize that the better brother, even if he didn't create those constructs for the purpose of an advantaged power dynamic, he certainly upheld those constructs and benefited from the advantaged power dynamic. Then, if the lesser brother starts talking about that enough, well, the more unfair it seems, the less tolerant the lesser brother becomes. That's why America's story has always been told through the hypothetical lens of equality, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. Because what kind of monster says lesser when talking about living beings? Equality. Certainly at the polls, yes? No. The Electoral College, as I've covered previously, is an archaic institution designed to offer compromise to the monstrous and treasonous South as a way to even out the representative political playing field, what with some human beings not being considered human beings, not having rights whatsoever, most not even being able to vote. Remember, white males. The idea of leaders chosen by boards of directors and policy written by corporations, it might be the easiest place to land, opinion-wise, that we the people, race, religion, gender, sexuality, nationality, ideology, sociology, or otherwise, are not only not involved in the process, but we also aren't even allowed in the room when the process happens. Like, poors can't just become a senator. That ain't how it works. And the poors are really starting to realize that. Some of us a little bit sooner than others. For conservatives, they're still in denial about their own part in this, and then the next stage of that is the acceptance that they too are victims. Right now, their victimhood is wrapped in this cult of personality and the last wheezing breath and flickering flame of white supremacy. And whether they know it or not, many of the institutions conservatives hold dear are centered on white supremacy. White male supremacy. White straight male supremacy. And the Christian part? That's just a convenient control tactic. People can't argue when their eternal soul is on the line, right? You tie that right into your politics, and you've got a combustible recipe for disaster. Now, build onto that an entire economic and social framework centered on the 7 deadly sins. What did any of us think was going to happen? Today, America's socioeconomic political fabric is tearing. We are divided. This part of the story has been just over 100 years in the making and traces its roots back to the post-Reconstruction failings of American capitalism that led to the Great Depression. This part of the story, America's story, our story, is drenched in blood money and corruption. Moreover, it's steeped in fascist ideals, with a Bible at one side and the flag, the anthem, and the pledge on the other. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Between them, a fill-in-the-blank of authoritarian rule, the unholiest of trinities. You see, in most recent history, they didn't need Donald Trump to be a great president. They just needed Donald Trump to be president, to lower the bar for who would come next. Socially, morally, ethically, legally, in every way, lower the bar. Certain politically, yeah. If Americans, Republicans even, would vote for Donald Trump, if Christians would vote for Donald Trump, they would vote literally anybody in, right? My argument is that our most recent insurrection might have been an orchestrated event. However, while some want to absolve themselves of the guilt associated with January 6th and supporting the candidate and the party that incited that by claiming the police let them in or it was a setup, I argue that January 6th was just a test. The conservative fascist power players, knowing a revolution is inevitable, figured to let the insurrection happen to see where our government might be weak. Looking back on history, an actual physical hostile takeover was something the right hadn't seen attempted. They came close, once, and that's what we're going to discuss later in this episode. They didn't expect to overturn the election. They just needed a herd of easily manipulatable, uneducated traitors to believe they could overturn the election. Those power players manipulated and used those uneducated traitors to fuck around so they could find out. For next time. Because America, there will be a next time. What you'll hear in this episode is about the previous times this was attempted. But please, do not kid yourselves. There will be a next time. And it's just a question of which side will be more prepared. January 6th, 2021. America and the world saw actual devolution before us on live television. We had seen the slow slide down the Christo-fascist rabbit hole for so many Americans over the course of the previous 20 years, at least. Then, on that day, when we all knew something was going to happen, something did happen. People who claimed to be Americans protested the results of what might have been the final free and fair election the country would see. This was beyond sore loserdom. Many came prepared for whatever the something that we all knew was going to happen was going to happen. They brought equipment and gear. Many were dressed for the occasion. They had guns, lots of them, ready, planted around the area in vehicles, just in case. Some people got swept up in the moment. Sunk cost fallacies, herd mentality. In other words, they were in too deep to back out due to their pride and ego. Then, when caught up in a moment of furor of frenzy instigated by a furor in a frenzy, some people kind of just lost their minds. and that primal brain took over. Yeah, it is less evolved. I would argue that January 6th is the example psychological difference between a left protest and a right protest, and that the right loses their minds and pushes protests to a riot is evidence of their sociopathic, narcissistic, unhinged nature. It's in the politics and the values. It's right there in the platform. Succumbing to violence in that moment isn't a politically partisan quality, though. My argument is the thin line between a leftist and a fascist in this regard is the left can peacefully protest, even aggressively, without resorting to throwing of bricks. They might talk about throwing bricks, but they aren't just for throwing bricks. The right is more like dressing up as the left does, coming to the left's protests, throwing bricks to instigate the devolved riot. Like the right is more prone to instigation, while the left is more prone to talking, until given the go-ahead to go, and then the left is all like, ugh. Like most wouldn't throw a brick until bricks are thrown. This is something the right has known for quite some time. Delegitimize, destabilize the opponent by making them look like violent radicals. We've seen this in recent history with some of the most publicized protests and riots. Those charged are mostly right-wing extremists dressed as the other thing, then accusing the other thing of being a thing and doing the things. There's evidence of this. Still, on January 6th, that crowd was filled with those types, of course, many, but also other angry Americans who just wanted to show up and be heard, who didn't intend on storming the Capitol. Now, I'm not excusing the insurrectionists or absolving leftists of their trots over the line. I'm saying that throughout history, bad people have found opportunities to be bad. Most of the time, bad people can mask themselves and assimilate into society, so long as that society isn't too nice. This is why you see politically reasoned relocations, with left-leaners seeking to get out of the southern states and those right-leaners seeking greener plantations below the Mason-Dixon. This is nothing new. Blue cities, red everything else. It's why left-leaning smarties seek asylum in civilized cities, while the gullible and slower-to-think righties don't often leave their hometowns. Sounds like mass generalizations and stereotypes someone like me should be above. Prove me wrong. There are exceptions. I know smart people who stayed small town. I know dipshits in big cities. But when we see election night maps, and it's big blobs of blue where there is shit and masses of red where there's nothing at all, this is why. Opportunity is blue, stagnancy is red. There was a reason they were the Montana Freemen and not the Manhattan Freemen. They are the 3%, not the 97%. The cult wackos in Waco weren't in Washington, though Washington sure has its quota of cult wackos. No, the Branch Davidians weren't near a heavy population. Lots of these places where extremism breeds are in the smaller, rural, less educated, less evolved, less progressive areas. More conservative areas. Not always, of course, but lots of these people are already unhinged, irrational, and radicalized beyond repair through their culture, religion, community, these false ideals of loyalty and honor, and their entertainment media. Well, none of these things by themselves are the culprit. However, the collective manipulation of these factors truly is unforgivable and tantamount to grooming a child to accept abuse as normal, and then terrorizing that child into silence. I need you to pause for a moment, please. Process what I just said. There are some values, some principles that are so rooted in our very being that exploiting those should be a huge cultural no-no. In fact, violating or exploiting that, especially for profit or political gain, should be so unacceptable that when it happens, we notice. Those values are our sensitive no-no zones, with no doll to show the good doctor. Instead, every value we have in America has a price tag. Every moral we espouse comes with a cost. There's nothing pure or altruistic in our society, it seems. How can there be when the first thing anyone considers is the cost? Today, as an actor, I do films, television, voiceovers, lots of work. I do a lot of commercial work too. But when I was a kid, even before I thought I could be on TV, my dad got to be in a commercial for the place that he worked, the flooring store. I remember my dad playing the dad in the commercial. They had to get new flooring as the family, and Dad, chomping on this big wet cigar, had the line, "Yeah, but what's it gonna cost?" Every time America stands at the crossroads of ethics, I hear my father's single line from his short-lived acting career. We often don't consider costs beyond currency concerns, much less the greater human costs of our actions. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves, shall we? Rounding it back to the January 6th insurrection. The dumbing down and numbing down of society meets the radicalization of rural, uneducated America. I know one might argue there were some college credits in the crowd that day, but I'm talking about a respect for learning and knowing, a lifelong dedication and commitment to verifying and validating sources of information. Critical thinking, which was not present in the crowd that day on January 6th. As we watched that horrendous day unfold, we might have considered what would push someone to that level. After all, we have marginalized groups in this country who still don't have rights and freedoms afforded to white, straight Christian males. And you don't see them insurrecting a Capitol, do you? Mostly because there's a pretty good chance those groups would have been gunned down before they even started. But really, besides smart people and the rest of the world, who's keeping that score, am I right? Blind cultism is one answer. Fear's stoked, anger's agitated, so poorly educated and force-fed propaganda, then numbed down so much to the point they stop seeing some humans as humans. This is a cultural cancer that's been at the core of our issues from the beginning. Still, with the cowards flying their yellow flags, desperate to not be tread upon, storming the U.S. Capitol, there was a lot more to that event and what motivated some of those to act so violently, so rabid, so unhinged, so savagely uncivilized. The goal of that, I believe, was to cause chaos and force an overturn of America's free and fair 2020 election. They were upset Joe Biden won. Actually, my argument is that Joseph Robinette Biden could have been literally anyone. They were upset they lost and sought to upend the monopoly board. But elections are lost all the time. What was so different about this election? The January 6th insurrection wasn't just another protest turned riot gone out of hand. This was a deliberate attempt to dethrone America's seat of democracy once and for all. This was nearly 100 years in the making. I know, I just said they didn't expect to overturn the election. But I was talking about the power players who instigated this. Those who stormed the Capitol had different goals than those who pushed them. You see, we the people, disorganized and divided, play the short game of survival because we're working for low wages to drown in a materialistic, commercialized, vapid society of capitalism run amok. Some of those who work forces, the ones who burn crosses, well, they play the long game. They know a loss today is generational. Riding that ship may be a task they leave for their children or grandchildren. This is why you and I don't get a seat at that table, folks. This is why you see dynasties like the Clintons, Bushes, Kennedys, Roosevelts, Rockefellers, and more. There are way more. And they aren't political party unique. They are across the ideological spectrum when they can amass enough influence and money to be. They aren't even always directly involved in politics, but maybe more involved in the business that influences politics. Again, I'll ask you, who do you know who could even run for office today? Realistically. You don't see Brandons in power, do you? Biden doesn't count unless you share DNA markers with your spouse. The idea that John F. Kennedy was delivered into power solely on the privileged back of a wealthy, elite, powerful father who groomed his sons for the kind of power he needed, and the fact that when one went down, another stepped right up to take the place, and when he went down, the third was Ted Kennedy. He was the fuck up of the lot, but still. I've said it before, I'll say it here because it applies. Since the Dixiecrat election of 1968, where Nixon won, the Republicans were prepping Ronald Reagan to be the eventual president. Now, that didn't happen in 1976, but Reagan Republicans conspired to ensure it would happen in 1980. 1976 was Gerald Ford's turn. He was Nixon's VP, and after that, Vietnam, etc., the GOP still didn't have the wherewithal to just start fresh. Carter won in 76, but Reagan, who primaried Ford, was sitting in the wings with his "I told you so" smug arrogance and letting everyone know they went with the wrong guy. Before Ford officially lost, hell, I'd say before Ford even ran, the Republicans were preparing for an eventual Reagan coronation one day. Reagan was the golden child of the wealth and the business sectors. He was brought up through the ranks, indoctrinated, and groomed to be a Wall Street puppet. He and the wealthy fascist elite who had their hands up his ass won, even when they lost. Ford won the nomination, lost the presidency, then the wheels were set in motion for the backup plan. One might argue Reagan didn't really want to win in 76, seeing the global economic downshift on the horizon. Instead, let a Democrat win, let nature take its course, and then he could ride in on the white horse named ego like he always wanted to in Hollywood, saving the day, being the hero, the leading man, and being the fifth face on Rushmore. The condition of the country, the economy, tax laws, foreign relations, well, everything Ford and the Republicans left for Carter would ensure that Jimmy Carter was entangled in a web of fuckery that would consume his entire first term. See 2020 Trump and Biden. It's a playbook, and that was the audible. Now, the repetition of that history. And why? Since then, Reagan in the late 70s, as far as influencing the country's politics, it's been one ideological dynasty clashing with another. Literally just two. Reagan, Reagan, Bush. Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, Trump, Biden. Reagan and Bush's are the same, as is with Trump. Clintonian politics were echoing throughout the Obama administration, through his conservative Vice President Joe Biden, and even Obama's actions against Occupy Wall Street, and then former President Clinton's wife, Hillary Clinton, who thought she should be president simply because her husband got to be president. Then she was named Secretary of State under Obama. Then, after the disastrously corrupt Trump regime, Clintonian politics reemerged in 2020 to coronate Obama's sidekick and lifelong conservative Joe Biden for his turn. Two ideologies over the course of my lifetime. These aren't political parties either. They are ideological subsets within each party. Two dynasties that have nothing to do with we the people. Essentially, four families: Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Biden. Yeah, Trump and Obama are in there, sure, not dynasties. Also not necessarily career politicians the way the others were. Those two also were political outliers, if not political outsiders, at the time of their initial campaigns. Very few people knew of Obama until it was time to vote for him. Very few people knew of Trump politically. Reagan's journey to the White House was long, as was with the two Bushes, a father and a son whose terms were separated by only 8 years of Bill Clinton. 1976 to 2024. Reagan, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Obama, Obama, Trump, Biden. Winning or running. Either way, influencing America's politics and beyond. In nearly half a century, America's presidential politics have been centered around Reagan and Clinton. These two presidents did more to annihilate the American working class than almost any other president since the Great Depression. I've covered this under different contexts before in previous episodes. Why is this important here? Because some of those who work forces play the long game. The long game was the deliberate dumbing down and numbing down of society. Amoral and unethical men in power making the absolute worst decisions for society based on greed. We the people kept at a snail's pace stagnant growth, while the wealth for the wealthy just increases exponentially. The differences between these critical points in history is this: the internet, social media, podcasting, instant gratification of finding out what we didn't know before and finding that out now. Wall-to-wall, 24/7, in-your-face, unavoidable news headlines, which we didn't have in the 1930s or the 1970s. In fact, what we have today regarding the media and social media, we owe to Reagan and Clinton. And I don't mean that as homage, but more like pitchforks and torches. The vapid cesspool of social division, mental stress, never-ending narratives, and the onslaught of constant stimuli from every direction is because of the too much, too soon introduction of technology and the blatant disregard for science and regulation for the sole reason of profit, greed, and exploitation of the working class. This is nothing new. Stories have been told long before Twain's trip to England, which inspired The Prince and the Pauper. The idea of two equals, twins, identical in every way except privilege, the same in all manners but class. Hell, we can argue Twain's work resembled many other stories and parables throughout time. However, in this story, it illustrates, among other things, the disparity of human caste systems, with not only presenting the idea that there are disparities in class systems, but that even despite equality, those systems exist, and those systems oppress the lesser thans. Now, the story I'm going to tell you isn't one of the inequality of Twain's two princes, but instead one of a corporate fascist regime that almost took over America's government nearly a century ago. To Twain's work, maybe America's better brother and lesser brother are the wealthy elite 1% and the we the people, respectively. Maybe, just maybe, we are the same and the only difference is financial class. Things like race, gender, nationality, labels of whatever nature divide us as a society, so we don't notice or subconsciously are willing to accept that the better brother and lesser brother of America are equals, just brothers, and we don't acknowledge that one has been exploiting the other to keep their position as the better brother. The story I'm going to tell is the story of the better brother's attempt to permanently seize the power and force the lesser brother in a position of subjugation, servitude, and serfdom. How does that relate to January 6th or political dynasties? I'll spoil that for you now before the story, just for context going in. Not to taint the jury pool or lead the witness, Your Honor, but to put the power dynamic of American capitalism into proper perspective. Ted Kennedy was the least of the Kennedys, in age and every other way. He was the bottom of that DNA barrel. In fact, nepotism was his strong suit. JFK, RFK, Ted. EMK? Forget the non-male-born Kennedy kids. They were just wife material back then, married off to build the wealth and influence circle. That's the story of the elites. That's how they got Schwarzenegger. Edward Moore Kennedy, Teddy, just simply didn't have what his brothers had. Some of that was the documented unethical and unscrupulous, entitled personality that pretty much was a Kennedy family trait. With the Kennedys, it's like the facts of life. You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the Kennedys. But they aren't different from any other political dynasty. They're just a glowing example of the issues between the us versus them of American classism, elitism, and political influence. They all come from wealth, privilege, and influence. Then members of the given family are groomed for business, and others are groomed for the influence peddling that will make that business more profitable, more powerful. Fill in the blank with whatever name you like. I'm using the Kennedys because John F. Kennedy was a politician. He was the youngest president America had when he was elected. His rise to the top of the political arena wasn't by accident. In fact, John's eldest brother might have been the chosen one, but he died serving in World War II, undoubtedly at least in part on someone's intent to build a resume worthy of the White House. It's a big risk that didn't pay off, but that's how these people think. John was next in line. After he died, we know the story. But let's go back just paternal lineage. John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph, was a businessman and politician, very wealthy, very influential. Joe's father, Patrick Joseph, or PJ, was, surprise, a businessman and politician. PJ's father, Patrick Kennedy, was an affluent businessman and, again, politician. Patrick was an Irish immigrant and the great-great-grandfather of the 20th century Kennedy kids. He was nothing remarkable, if we're going to be honest. He was a cooper, a barrel maker, until he died in his mid-30s of tuberculosis. The Kennedy story could have died with him, except that Patrick had kids with his wife, Bridget. who was left a widow in 1858. For the next 30 years, John, Bobby, and Teddy's great-grandmother would toil in various jobs as a domestic employee, a maid, a housekeeper, etc., then on to be a hairstylist and a grocer, all the way to achieving rare success for a woman in those days as a proper property owner. Like the story of the Kennedys is one of female empowerment because the entire line could have and should have ended there. A single widowed mother right before the Civil War struggles and builds a Camelot. Well, eventually. Again, I'm not invalidating what I'm telling you when I say the Kennedys aren't important to this story. What is important is the fact that this wealth, privilege, class, power, influence, and most importantly, political involvement goes back with this one family over a century and a half. One might look at that from the perspective of what a rags to riches immigrant success story. However, mine is a perspective of grooming generation after generation to maintain that power, influence, wealth, and privilege. If I amass a certain amount of financial success, sure, my family should reap those rewards. If I reach a position of influence, I'm sure my children might have opportunities. Maybe even my grandchildren based just off the name. But what I'm talking about in America, with the Kennedys as an example, is indicative of so many families in so many areas. This influence is Massachusetts, of course, and beyond with the Kennedys. But in every community, town, city, county, state, and so on, the country is infected with this level of nepotism, wealth hoarding, influence peddling, and planting familial flags in positions of power with little hope for anyone of unseating that power. Which means little hope of anyone but these families ever getting a seat at the table. Every day in America, decisions for so many are made by very few. Those very few who make the decisions often have little understanding or perspective on what it takes to be the many. Those decisions aren't often made in the best interests of we the people. Instead, the people are kind of an afterthought, a filter over the decision that's already been made and is less, is this the right thing, the best thing for our constituents? Is this what they want? And more, do you think they'll vote us out of office if we do this? This is what our donors want. When we realize that weapons and war, drugs, oil, organized crime, these are the big industries of the world. These are the industries that keep the global economy flourishing. In fact, here's the big truth that's going to hurt. World peace, sobriety, independence from fossil fuels, and an end to corruption, collusion, and organized crime would spell absolute doom for most of the world. It would send the economies of dozens of nations into turmoil, global recession, chaos. Sounds hopeless, right? Now, given what we know about generational wealth, influence, and power when it comes to business and politics, given what we just learned about the world's economy, given what we've learned all season long on Overthinking Everything, given what we know about America being one of the most influential nations who set many standards across the globe for various areas, when a candidate is running for president of the United States of America and is running on a platform of advocating for the workers to give them more power and more of a voice in our system, what do you think is going to happen? There are many candidates over the last century plus who rocked the boat for Washington. From 1912 and Teddy Roosevelt, whose Progressive Party nearly won the election from the outside of one of the two major parties, beating his former ally William Howard Taft, but losing eventually to Woodrow Wilson. All the way to Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, who actually had a chance at winning had the Democratic Party listened to the American people. Had the American people listened in social studies when they were in school. Many candidates between those 2 points in history threatened the status quo for the powers that be in this country. Many candidates you've never heard of tried and were silenced. Ted Kennedy was not one of those candidates, mind you. His manipulation of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party was solely for his own ambitions. Ted had a chip on his shoulder that it was never his time, an arrogance and entitlement that he got away with murder, so why shouldn't he get to be president? Okay, maybe some of that is conjecture and my own opinion, but Ted Kennedy in 1980 stood against the incumbent Jimmy Carter, who was a pretty conservative Democrat back then, mostly due to his Christian faith. Calling Kennedy progressive is inaccurate. In fact, the parallels between today and 1980 are pretty striking. Where the party is today, one side struggling to appeal to the middle, and the other side irate that anyone would want to appeal to the middle is similar. But even within that latter group, within the left is a division between the more level-headed liberal-leaning lefties who understand the realities of our political system and the pie-in-the-sky full-on anarchists who will only be happy with the chaos of burn it all down with no regard for the consequences on the marginalized communities who might struggle under the same status quo that protects what little stability we have. Back then, Nixonian politics were a disgrace on this nation, but many conservatives wouldn't renounce Nixon, and even if they did, they shifted support to someone just as vile in Ronald Reagan. With the economy suffering, global tensions rising, and shortages on fuel and other necessities, the late 1970s was turning volatile. The remnants of Vietnam were still fresh, and the culture shifts were a lot for many to handle. Plus, the political parties at that time weren't as clearly defined as they are today, or maybe at least party politics didn't define us as clearly back then. Reagan's ascension was predetermined. Had he not won, I think it might have been catastrophic for the Republican Party, who had placed all their ideological eggs in his basket. Reagan had to win in 1980, but beating an incumbent is difficult. Reagan won in 1980 because of several key factors, among those the treason he committed to free the hostages in Iran. However, helping to tank the economy before the '76 election, conspiring with Gerald Ford and others to ensure that there was a ticking economic time bomb set to go off on Inauguration Day, and only Republicans knew the code to shut it off. If they won, they could easily undo the damage they had set up. If they lost, they'd just let it ride, and it's Carter's mess to fix. A mess Carter, well, no one had any hope of being able to fix in one term. Except Carter couldn't secure the support within his own party during that one term. Rather than fighting for unity to come together and defeat the more dangerous threat to the American people, the American working class that republicanism would bring, Ted Kennedy saw a window of opportunity, challenged Carter, primaried him, lost, and then sort of ceded the nomination but didn't really throw his support behind Carter. The Democratic National Convention that year devolved into fistfights and tensions. They all boiled over. What resulted was many disenfranchised voters swinging toward the stronger message of Reagan's cult of personality. Today, we have the luxury of knowing what conservative policies and economics do to the American working class. We knew back then, but many were swayed by a charming Hollywood star. Had the Democrats been able to push hard for unity, even behind Carter, things might have played different. Instability within the party, thanks to the entitlement of Ted Kennedy, groomed and indoctrinated throughout his life to believe he should have the crown simply because he was a Kennedy, handed the White House to Reagan, a man who was only in the position to do so because he was from an elite, influential family, and it was his birthright, right? Because Ted Kennedy's brothers were who they were, and his father was who he was because his father was who he was, and his mother was who she was. His influence was unnatural and corrupted our history. Had the Kennedy influence been tempered and Ted's seat truly open to someone who more represented we the people, rather than being held by a spoiled rich kid, a murderer, maybe things could have played different. In 2016, things played out very similarly within the Democratic Party. There was no incumbent, but I'll argue that coming off Bill Clinton's working-class wrecking ball administration into this disastrous Bush reign and into what looked to be a more progressive Obama administration, the decision in 2016 for Democrats was pretty clear. Status quo politics with Hillary back to corrupt politics as normal, or Bernie Sanders, a dark horse independent who had spent his career in Washington as an outsider fighting for change with little support? Politics as usual, or a push past Obama for progressivism? America decided. The Democratic Party decided too. It's just that what the people wanted and what the party needed were not necessarily aligned. This may seem disjointed because I'm all over timelines between 1912 and 2016, but it's all the groundwork I'm laying for the story I'm going to tell next. Bernie Sanders knew history. Bernie Sanders knew 1932. Bernie Sanders knew 1944, and Bernie Sanders knew 1980. While many of his more aggressive supporters were waiting on Bernie to take the stand against the DNC, give them the wagging finger and push for a third-party run, Bernie knew the mathematical odds were not in his favor, and while he might have even won on a long shot without support from one of the major parties, the division in America and the division in Washington, it would have been insurmountable for a single term and would make a re-election campaign even a longer shot. Bernie was a modern-day New Dealer. The days of FDR were over. America wouldn't elect a single person beyond 2 terms, even if they could legally. They might have with Obama, but we can't know. Nixon tried and failed. The DNC conspired to give Hillary the nomination because it was her turn. The Clinton influence peddling paid off. And don't kid yourself. I don't believe for 1 minute had she won that the Equal Rights Act would have been ratified. Politics as usual was the Clintonian way. Unfair as it may have been to the American people, the game was rigged for politics as usual. The status quo would be the story, and that story would go on to win the popular vote. Still, with the Electoral College in play, the Democrats lost. However, that wasn't because of Bernie Sanders. Bernie did what he needed to do. He tried, he lost. However, that went down. And when he lost, he conceded peacefully and in such a way as to unite his base with Democrats as much as possible to defeat Donald Trump. Many people just couldn't stomach Hillary Clinton for a litany of reasons, some foreign misinformation and propaganda, some very well-founded based on the Clinton experience. Still, third-party voters aren't the reason Hillary lost. Hillary lost because Trump voters voted for Trump and a lot of disenfranchised people didn't vote at all. Some protest voted, but the Trump votes in 2016 plus the unvoters are a much more significant pool from which to fish for blame on that loss. Bernie did his job in losing. He very well could have fought and may have won. In fact, here's what I will say that might be controversial. Many more Bernie supporters voted for Hillary than Hillary voters would have voted for Bernie. Now let that settle in for just a moment. The Democrats played their games again in 2016, just like Ted Kennedy did in 1980, just like they had played them in 1944 to oust Henry A. Wallace from FDR's VP ticket in favor of white supremacist war hawk and genocidal maniac Harry S. Truman. Bernie Sanders did not play games. Bernie Sanders, who spent a career in Washington fighting for leftist and progressive values, shelved all those ideals, fell in line with a party he didn't belong to, threw his support behind Hillary, and encouraged his supporters to do the same. He lost supporters by doing this because it was more important to him to unify than to win. The Democrats then began their bully campaign against anyone who dared speak out against them, their candidate, their policies. That's what lost the election in 2016. The Democrats' toxic behavior against their own allies on the left pushed many voters away from the party, away from voting altogether, at a time when many had no way of knowing just how corrupt the Donald Trump administration would be. No coup, no insurrection, some protests, sure, there always are, but nothing close to a "we didn't get our way, so we're storming the Capitol and hanging people if they don't break the law" debacle. Ted Kennedy tore the Democratic Party apart in 1980 due to his ego, ambition, arrogance, and entitlement to the power a Kennedy should have. Ted Kennedy didn't quite get the message sent to Jack and Bobby. Apparently, the tabloids and the Kennedys were the only ones who loved the Kennedys. Bobby's son, RFK Jr. launched a widely publicized run for the 2024 election, running as a Democrat at first and then as a dark horse independent, a disruptor, if you will. The historical significance may be too soon to tell. Still, here we are with the Kennedys, who are like herpes. They go away for a while, then rear their ugly privileged heads when they're the least of what we need. That entitlement and privilege of not just the Kennedys, but the establishment of elitism in America. Privilege, the corporate and political dynasties, that is causing the true division in America. Ted in 1980 and his nephew less than a half century apart. Bernie Sanders learned from Teddy Kennedy and even Henry A. Wallace. Wallace was a bit different than Kennedy in 1980 in that Wallace was the vice president and was on the ticket with FDR. He was the people's choice. They voted for him, and they're heir apparent in their eyes. That's why Democrats wouldn't let him be the next president. See, Wallace, too, wasn't a Democrat loyalist. Wallace was a working class loyalist. He was loyal to the people, like Bernie. But he fought for his job, for the life of his political ideals, and for the life of the American ideals of leftism and progressivism. He knew what was at stake back then. The 1944 convention was contentious, fists flying, people passionately pushing for their perspective, power, and preferred politician. Harry Truman and other Democratic power players pushed for the party and Roosevelt to oust Wallace, who was far more progressive and left-leaning than even FDR. While Washington, most of Washington, and corporate America was done with New Deal policies and ready to turn the corner and turn the profit faucet back on, Wallace would have expanded those programs, while Truman would have slowly scaled back. Wallace almost assuredly wouldn't have dropped the bombs on Japan. Truman couldn't wait to. Hell, Truman would have done it at the convention if it would have won him the presidency. Bernie Sanders studied history. Sanders knew what was at stake for the country in 2016 and that American unity, the strong fabric of our democracy, was more important than him winning. And in 2020, when Joe Biden ran just to keep Bernie from winning, Bernie knew then that while he could run as an independent and probably win, it wasn't in the best interest of the country. Not policy, not economics, but the unity of our political system was more important than anything else, any ambition, ideal, or policy. While Sanders' policies would have benefited the American working class far more than anything Republicans or Democrats had done, Sanders knew that the American working class couldn't afford to be that divided, that unstable. Divided on a level where even their political parties dissolved into chaos. For Bernie Sanders to fight in 2016 or 2020, that would have been about Bernie Sanders, not about the movement. And Bernie Sanders was always about the movement more than he was about Bernie Sanders. But the issue with a candidate like Bernie Sanders, the reason the Republicans spread so much misinformation about him, and the reason Democrats were so willing to go to the lengths of bullying and harassment that they did to keep him from being president, is that, well, when a candidate is running for president of the United States and is running on a platform of advocating for the workers to give them more power and more of a voice in our system, what do you think is going to happen? History is written by the victors. That's probably why you've never heard this story, certainly not in a classroom. So far, I've talked about a lot of everything but this incident to set up a story that honestly isn't as long as it should be considering what it's about. It's rather anticlimactic, which is probably part of the reason it's glossed over in history. History, after all, is about things that actually happened, not things that almost happened or would have happened had it not been for ... American capitalism makes a small group of people very wealthy. It earns many other people just enough that they're just comfortable enough to not ask questions. It strangles those at the very bottom, but it creates quite a bit of business for the economy through that suffering. Prescriptions are high. Insurance is high. Medical costs are high. Energy is high. Consumables are high. Recreational stuff is high. In many states, people aren't even allowed to get high recreationally or otherwise. Rent is astronomical. Basic necessities are being exploited for profit at an all-time high. Our economy is headed for a crash like we have never seen before. Between NFTs, Bitcoin, CDs, IRAs, debit cards, our money is all fake, digital, and backed by absolutely nothing. No gold in Fort Knox. If you hadn't heard, all the gold in California is in a bank in the middle of Beverly Hills in somebody else's name. It isn't just the U.S., though. The world's global economy is built on debt, and debt is crushing more than just the working class. Our economy is a pyramid scheme, folks, more like a Ponzi, if you will. We watched the insurrection of 2021 go down. January 6th unfolded live on television, and many wondered after that, what if this mega movement, which embodies a lot of law enforcement, veterans, former military, former law enforcement, current military, what if they all swore loyalty to the movement more than the Constitution, America, or we the people? Could the military come after us? Could they turn our communities' police forces into the SS? They almost did on January 6th. 90 years prior, an actual plot to take over America almost happened. A hostile, military-backed coup of the United States government, a hostile overthrow of a free and fair election, a violent and hostile takeover of the United States government was planned and cut short before it even started. Spoilers. Here's the funny thing about that story. I offer the spoiler because, of course, the fascist, capitalistic, corporate, hostile takeover of America didn't happen, right? FDR was elected, he stayed elected, and was elected to 4 terms. The New Deal happened, and America was saved. Today, Citizens United, stagnant wages, and the bulwaristic take-it-or-leave-it attitude of many employers makes one pause to consider if this treasonous plot was actually thwarted or not. The reality of the time between Reconstruction and the Great Depression was disturbing, to say the least. America's economy, not just in the South, struggled to find its footing after Lincoln basically said, hey, you can't have free labor anymore. That unexpected overhead American businesses and plantations should have been paying from the very start, annihilated the bottom line accounting for so many. I've said it before. One day you have no labor costs, the next day you have no labor, and if you want labor, it's going to cost. It wasn't nearly as simple as that, but basically, after that, almost every group except Africans and African Americans, anyone who wasn't black, was tossed into the non-consensual labor pool. Women, Mexicans and Latinos, Asians, of course, with our railroads and whatnot, indigenous, immigrants from literally anywhere and everywhere. And children. For years, children worked in this country from 10 or younger, years old, in mines, factories, whatever. Woodrow Wilson, for all his eccentricities, mental illness, health issues, and conservative policies, did embrace some of the progressive policies Teddy Roosevelt, the former Republican president and Progressive Party leader, as well as Eugene Debs, leader of the American Socialist Party, fought for. Teddy Roosevelt sort of absorbed much of Debs' support in the 1912 election, which honestly accounted for enough voter support for a second-place finish, giving Wilson a run for his money and issuing a mandate on Taft and the Republicans that we needed change and that Republicans would be the last in line to issue it if we, the people, had anything to say about it. At the polls, anyway. If Taft had won, who knows when child labor would have been outlawed. Instead, workers' rights was on the forefront of voter issues in 1912 because the economy was up and down. There was a world war brewing and America didn't want in. We were still reeling emotionally, socially, and economically from our own Civil War a generation back. America First would be a phrase brought to light by Woodrow Wilson during his re-election campaign. But the attitude was there long before. American isolationism is nothing new. Fix our problems here at home before we well, do anything, fix anywhere else, or help anyone else. For this, in 1916, Wilson promised to keep America out of war, a promise he never had an intention on keeping. In fact, shortly after swearing his second oath, he rescinded that promise to the American people. Never trust a liar, folks. America did get into war. Child labor was abolished, women were given the right to vote. And the white people in America were riding the economic ebbs and flows of early 20th century capitalism. Capitalism run amok. See the Roaring Twenties. Then, as the economy crashed again, because it had crashed or at least receded consistently since the Civil War ended, Americans were desperate. Our nation was holding on by a thread. Corporate greed and conservative economics had squeezed every bit of blood out of that stone, and there wasn't a drop left. The American people were starving, standing in bread lines, and had given up on making ends meet long ago. At least if they had jobs, even shitty-paying jobs, we the people would have been so busy with our shitty lives, we wouldn't notice how bad we had it. But when they took our jobs away, conservatives and corporations, I mean, and all we had to do was be poor and stand around begging for a bite, reality had time to sink in for a bit. By the time the stock market crashed, well, which one? Right? Before we get too ahead of ourselves with this story, let's beef up the preface. When the Civil War ended, America's economy almost had to endure a hard reset. A lot of things about America had to endure a hard reset. But as I said, these states are Americans, then they're traitors and not Americans, and then they're kind of allowed to be Americans again. The pure economic perspective of the mid-1800s is a graduate-level college course in and of itself. So understand that we can't begin to understand, and just know we were fucked. America's economy was in recession starting as soon as the war ended in April of 1865 until 1896. America's economy was unstable, to say the least. 31 years. The entire period of reunification of America and the reassimilation of the traitorous Confederates and the assimilation of the now freed African Americans. All that was done amid financial struggle, turmoil, and instability. During this period, even though production picked back up, many in the country were still reeling from the war's after effects, and business was slow to grow. New businesses weren't opening as much, and much of the country, I think, was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. So much horror. The end might have seemed too good to be true. Wait and see mentality, right? Stockpile your money and gold in hiding places more than banks. The rail industry boomed, and despite the Transcontinental Railroad changing the game for inter-American economics, and despite this entire 3-decade period paralleling the farmers' movement, the American economy as a whole struggled. These were long-game economic moves, and the American people's short-game economy was in the outhouse. One of the biggest reasons being that in 1869, something called the Black Friday gold panic occurred, where two wealthy investors sought to manipulate President Ulysses S. Grant using his sister Jenny's husband, Abel Corbin. Hoping to use the brother-in-law card to get their advantage, Jay Gould and James Fisk used Corbin to get close to the president to get insider information on America's gold policy. Gold back then was the real currency of the country. The notes, our dollars, were guaranteed by the gold in our reserves. Unlike today, when our dollars are backed by a weird digital image some 19-year-old graphic design dropout made on his MacBook. Their scheme worked and threw the country into a panic and cast a dark shadow of corruption over Grant's entire presidency, so much that fellow Republican James A. Garfield, chairman of the House Banking Committee, then led the investigation into Grant, which eventually exonerated the president, but did not issue a decree of innocence. In fact, Grant's wife or his sister weren't asked to testify, and it is widely historically accepted that the Grants did benefit personally and financially from this manipulation. History, after all, written by the victors, and this would be a prime example of partisan corruption and cover-ups. Regardless, this was just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to wealthy investors manipulating the powers that be for their own corrupt gains. Black Friday. With deals too good to be true. That launched a year and a half of recession. Those things on the long game, like rail travel, interstate commerce, and the agriculture industry, helped America bounce back, as well as distancing from the Civil War. More businesses and Americans probably came to feel more stability. However, within 3 years, America would see the Panic of 1873 and the Long Depression that followed. The Long Depression, which sounds like a 90s alternative rock song, many economists regard to last from 1873 to 1896. 23 years of economic depression. The Panic of 1873 was more global, specifically Europe and the States. Though this long depression that followed, there was the Panic of 1884, which was related to a credit shortage, and in the UK, the Panic of 1890 or the Bearing Crisis. It wasn't unique to the UK, as it resulted in one of the most significant stock market declines in the US during the 19th century. We aren't even at the turn of the century, and America has seen very little more than economic turmoil, struggle, and instability. We often think of the Great Depression as this big economic upheaval in America. The picture I'm painting is that American capitalism has never worked, and this period is the reason why, and the example as to why it can't work. We're just getting started. Another movement that came out of this period of economic instability was the rise of the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party, which formed in 1892. This party's formation was the result of a few different movements in America, realizing individually they had similar values and goals, but limited power or influence, and setting aside their minor differences and coalescing under one party, a left-wing party that would eventually merge with the Democrats. While they didn't last very long, for about 17 years until 1909, 2 years before Progressive Party leader Teddy Roosevelt would come in second to Woodrow Wilson, they represented the working class, the real people of America. Just like every other third or independent party, there just wasn't a strong foundation of unity. Too many competing egos and ideals. Some wanted an open relationship with Democrats, and some wanted a true independent populist party. What the rise and fall of the Populist Party can tell us of this turn-of-the-century era is that America's socio-political culture was as volatile and unstable as our economy. In fact, the very basis of populism is a focus on we the people and seizing the power and influence from the elite. While now populism has come to label any anti-establishment of any lean, back then populism was a leftist ideal that was more specific. Also worth mentioning is the nativism that is closely aligned with historical populism. That prioritization of native-born over immigrant, which is laughable now, but even more so then since so many Americans were immigrants, give or take a degree or two of generational separation. America first indeed, right? These may sound like abstract terms, but just like now, things haven't changed. The wealth, even back then, was hoarded by a very few influential people. Just like the Black Friday shenanigans, some of those that work forces are the same that burn crosses. Wealth is power, and both corrupt. In fact, so much of the history that leads up to the 1930s bankers' coup, or the business plot, or Wall Street Putsch, which is the whole point of this episode, and I promise I'm getting to it, was centered around gold or silver, and very wealthy, greedy people seeking to manipulate those respective markets. In the episode Labor Pains from earlier this season, I made a case for America's working class to have their own political representation in legislature. This is why. The People's Party was a failure. Actual populism still exists today, but it's largely silenced by the major political machine who would be served no benefit from having a People's Party challenging the status quo of the two-party system. Here's what happened. Their first candidate, James B. Weaver, garnered 8.5% of the popular vote and even won 4 states, all of them out west. He was the first third party to win votes in the Electoral College post-Civil War. Sounds impressive, right? Except that by the next election in 1896, the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan, known as the Great Commoner, for his ability to relate to the regular Joe. Bryan was also nominated on the People's Party ticket as the populist candidate and the Democratic candidate. It's just that the populists rejected the vice presidential candidate of the Democrats. The Populist Party insisted that their party's leader, Thomas E. Watson, would be a strong number two. That ended up dropping a huge number two on the 1896 election, with William McKinley taking the big win. After that, the legitimacy of the party's independence didn't seem to resonate as much, and those who sought unification and compromise with the Democrats outnumbered those who wanted to remain truly an independent party. Over the course of the next dozen years, the fractured People's Party would disintegrate and become a near forgotten footnote in history books. There we go again, getting ahead of ourselves. Scoot back a bit on the politics, and let's see what the economy was doing during this period. In 1893, a year and a half from the last recession, America experiences the Panic of 1893, aptly named. Remember Monopoly? Reading Railroad? Well, the real Reading Railroad went wheels up, which wasn't a small deal. Then another run on gold, along with reduced European investments, led to a financial collapse in the U.S. Unemployment rates skyrocketed, and the American people were suffering. A year and a half is about as long as that lasted before a year and a half bounce back. The issue for most people is that bouncing back from economic turmoil is a much slower process than falling into it. Then, a year and a half after the Panic of 1893 ended, the Panic of 1896 hit the U.S. This wasn't nearly as significant as some of the panics before, but this did impact silver futures, which had been the subject of economic and political debate for many years following the Civil War. Like I said, gold and silver. The debate on exactly what should back our currency and how our money should be guaranteed was a huge dividing point for the powers that be during this period. As things started to slowly improve, between 1899 and 1904, America was carefully tightroping things economically, unstable, with no net below us. What's interesting here is that the recessive period of 18 months that started just before the turn of the century and lasted the first full year of the 20th century cleared, within 5 months of 1901, we would see the first ever crash of the New York Stock Exchange. J.P. Morgan, William and John D. Rockefeller right at the center of it, fighting over control of the Northern Pacific Railway. While the wealthy market manipulators lived happily ever after, thousands of America's smaller investors were taken off the board, annihilated permanently. Following the bounce back of the 1901 crash, which ended by late 1904, the Panic of 1907 significantly impacted America's economy for years to come. In fact, it was this event that is mostly to blame for the institution of one of America's most corrupt establishments. 1907, combined with the Panic of 1910 to 1911's lack of economic growth for corporate America and Americans, brought about a recession period that would change this country and the world. We hit rock bottom in 1913 with a full-on recession, and then the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law at the height of this recession. Then, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the catalyst for World War I, thrust the entire economic focus of the world into an economic spiral. However, if there's one principle humanity has realized and promoted like a deity, it's that war is good for the economy. In the short term. In that, if the economy's suffering, start a war somewhere. Not just for the distraction, but for the influx of economic stimulators like consumer demand and production, growth. The rise in production and demand from the events surrounding the First World War saw the United States bounce back relatively quickly, all things considered. But with the Treaty of Versailles came the harsh economic realizations of the war ending. That extra boost in production came to a halt. The troops came home but needed jobs. The recession rebounded in just over a year and a half, but what goes up must come down just as fast and hard. Welcome to the Depression of 1920. For a year and a half, America's growing pains in coming out of a war brought one of the worst years economically America has ever seen, and nobody felt that more than the American working class. It's during this period you'll find the era, the Roaring Twenties. It seems like with that kind of branding, an economic upturn and period of real growth, right? Now, while that's mostly true, we still saw two separate, over year-long recessions again. What goes up must come crashing down. In August of 1929, the speakeasies and the flapper girls were gone and the panic had set in with some of the bigwig bankers. It turns out America had an issue with overinflating its own worth. There have been many attempts in America's history to take us off the gold standard, which Nixon eventually did. But in the late 1920s, the rest of the world was digging their heels into gold as their guarantee for their currency. And maybe America didn't quite have the gold to cover their credit. Those interest rates are a killer, you know. Also, were the America First style tariffs America placed on imports, which hurt our economy and diminished our place among the collective world economy. There are many reasons the Great Depression happened. For 3 years and 7 months, America was struggling. But as we've learned, that's nothing new. America's economy has always been a sham. Maybe it's because we never found all that Confederate gold. However, with the American working class losing their jobs, the deflation and falling prices didn't help when your money was literally no good here. For the American people, this depression was close to 5 years. Again, for us, recovering from an economic crisis is exponentially longer and harder than falling into one. While America's economy rebounded for a brief period, we were right back into a full-on recession to end the 1930s. Those New Deal policies might have saved America in the long and short term, but they sure were costly. The Fed was also uncooperative during this period. America's economy wasn't growing until Pearl Harbor. Remember, America's economy was struggling until Woodrow Wilson broke his promise to the American people that if elected to a second term, we would not go to war. What Wilson and the powers that be knew then was that the people didn't know no better. They wouldn't have bought the truth that the U.S.'s involvement in the war was inevitable, and in fact, we had to get involved to take our place among the world powers. In fact, at that point, a war was about the only thing that was going to salvage American capitalism. Look, America, we're going to go kill a lot of people, but the good news is you're going back to work to fund all that murder. Back then, America had more of a conscience. So in 1939, America's economy was on its way to bouncing back fully from the Great Depression thanks to the start of World War II. Realize that only the very wealthy, powerful elite, names you've never heard of, regulate and control the money in America. The Federal Reserve, which isn't federal in any way. These are private bankers and the uber wealthy. Like if we were going to suggest a new world order or one of those secret societies existed, it's the Fed. They literally control everything. Everything in this world has a price tag. They control the price tags, the inventory, and the money we use to buy the things. I'm kind of teetering on conspiracy theories, suggesting that deliberate efforts have been made to control the flow of money and affect global matters, aren't I? Why is all this important enough to make up for an extended episode? Because everything comes down to money and greed. This is nothing new. I've covered it before. But to understand what I'm about to tell you, it's important to understand not so much the dates of these economic crises as it is the circumstances around these economic crises, the reasons for them, and the bigger picture of American economic struggle is more significant and consistent than just the Great Depression. We've been fooled, lied to, and gaslit into believing we went from the roaring 20s of excess and success to the crash that nearly killed capitalism, when in fact, America's economy wasn't stable to begin with, much less in the post-Civil War era leading up to the story you're going to hear next. It surely hasn't gotten much better since then, at least not for the American working class. American capitalism is an abject failure. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. America's economy has historically ebbed and flowed. When someone rocks the boat, surprise when we capsize. In the 1920s, we were holding on by a thread, living the lavish lifestyles of the rich and famous, and glamorizing publicly a lie most Americans didn't tell. The 1920s were hard for most of the American working class. Things didn't get much easier in the 1930s. By 1929, America's brand of capitalism was being exposed on the world stage for the abject failure it was, and the fallout of the Great Depression was out in the open. The revelation of the luxurious indulgence of the haves compared to the Dust Bowl black lung of the have-nots. There were two Americas, and the dividing line was between dollars and cents. In the early days of his presidency, as Washington fought over policy and his New Deal so many feared, Franklin Roosevelt was feeling pressure from all angles for his aggressive executive order style of governing. America had been put through the greed wringer by the Republicans, and Americans were over it. Populism and progressivism had brewed and battled one another behind the scenes for the better part of the previous 4 decades. In fact, it was Franklin's cousin Teddy Roosevelt who 20 years prior had managed to blend what was remaining of the People's Party, populism, America's Socialist Party, progressives, and other stray leftists under the united umbrella of the Progressive Party. As we've covered, that unity was good enough for a second-place presidential finish in 1912, but not much else. By the time Franklin ran his first, albeit losing, campaign on the back of Woodrow Wilson's America First philosophy, Americans were resentful of the Democrats and Woodrow Wilson for a variety of reasons. By the time FDR built enough support for his 1932 run, it wasn't that difficult to convince Americans change was necessary. Herbert Hoover and the Republicans drove America into the ground. However, the change FDR's New Deal would bring would be a seismic shift in how America operated, expanding the government's reach and influence, specifically in more rural areas. That New Deal would offer jobs to many Americans and bolster our bottom line immediately. The problem most had with the New Deal policies was the brutal way FDR went about enacting that legislation and the long-term costs associated with expanding and creating those jobs, that infrastructure, and those social programs. The governmental reach of the New Deal was unprecedented and flew in the face of those staunch anti-federalists still angry at the freeing of the slaves. Now, maybe that's a little too generalized and unfair, but we're seeing today those ideals certainly have coalesced into one ideological DNA cesspool. Some of those critics turned out to be correct somewhat. By 1945, America dipped into another recessive period, thanks to, guess what? The Second World War ending. War is good for business. Remember that. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. During these negotiations, New Deal negotiations, if you want to call them that, FDR was being pressured about his policies, and many of the haves were frustrated at what they viewed as handouts to the lesser-thans, the have-nots. Knowing what was brewing, FDR was rumored to have said to some of the most influential, to the rich, to the powerful elite when fighting for his New Deal vision for American resurgence, something along the lines of, you have to give the people something. You can't just let them have the crumbs. He knew that a hungry people cared less about laws and silly things like that. Revolution wasn't far from reality. If everything collapsed and the working class, who weren't so much working at that time or eating, bore the brunt, chaos was around the corner. Remember from earlier episodes when I spoke about the origins of monopoly and how the big economic debate in that turn of the century period was really who should shoulder the burden of taxation? The wealthy, who have it to spare, or we, the people, who are trying our damnedest to get to that point? The wealthiest of the wealthy had made their decision, and in the early 1930s, they almost executed it. What Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency spelled for Americans was a fresh start, a literal New Deal. This was FDR's way of saying the old deal, the rules in the game you were forced to play for so long, was unfair, and now we're going to make it a little more right. Well, imagine how that made those who benefited from that old game and those old rules feel. Threatened. They didn't care about their indulgence, greed, and ineptitude crashing our economy, threatened the global economy, and thrust millions into unemployment and poverty. They just increased their profit margins. They can't see us as humans. If they saw us as living, breathing, struggling, suffering humans, wouldn't it be harder to allow poverty? They allow poverty. Every wealthy person does. That's just a plain and simple pragmatic fact that's only challenged by maintaining the status quo so they can stay wealthy rather than helping even a small number of people. I know. You're thinking, but the wealthy do more to help than you do, Josh. Yes, mostly because it benefits them and they have the ability to, whereas I only have the ability to help others by writing books and sharing my knowledge, my perspectives. Then, if enough people buy my books and consume my content, then and only then, maybe I'll have the financial means to help others the way I've always wanted to. Haven't you? Well, you're not going to get there working your job, I'll tell you that. So the need grows, the aid shrinks, and the wealthier get wealthier, while offering the consolation prize of the illusion of helping. Meanwhile, shortly after the 1932 election, some of those elite, those whose names have been lost to the victor-written history, set out to change the course of that history and the course of American democracy. The business, investment, and financial industries, along with the segment of Americans who didn't want the government to grow too powerful, weren't too keen on all those new government jobs, paying folks well with all those government pensions and benefits, because who would want to go work in a factory or on a farm when they could go work for one of these New Deal institutions like the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example? Where I grew up in rural Tennessee, if you worked for TVA, you were set. If you worked for a plant, it was hit and miss. The business plot is an oft-debated footnote in our history, but one that very well could have happened had it not fallen apart before it really started. The ramifications would have changed the world. As World War II was starting, the rise of global fascism was taking hold, not just in Germany and Europe, but across the very round globe. There's a reason Nazis escaped to countries like the United States and Argentina, places where they knew they would be well taken care of. The Great Depression thrust so many Americans into poverty and struggle. The luxuries of our principles would begin to fade. It's easy for a man to resist being a thief when he has enough to eat. The hungrier he gets, the more apt for stealing he becomes. It's the literal entire plot of the Dan Aykroyd-Eddie Murphy classic film Trading Places. It's easier than you think to take someone desperate, angry, and disenfranchised and convince them to be a Nazi. Groups like the KKK and other organizations back then, built on white supremacy, were already there. They just didn't have a dedicated political party all the time. The extent and reach of this plot and who was involved is also up for debate, but what's known is that some of these conspirators were sympathetic to the Nazis, if not tied to them. The idea was to overthrow the United States government and replace FDR's administration with a more corporate-friendly system bordering on authoritarian fascism. When I say bordering on, I mean full on. Their plan was to radicalize and then militarize veterans unhappy with the direction of their country, infiltrate our active military, and target specific offices, positions of power, and locations that would force Franklin Roosevelt to step down as President of the United States of America. In other words, a militarized insurrection and hostile takeover, a coup of a free and fair American presidential election. This attempted purge of New Deal Democrats from our political system is generally referred to as the failed 1930s bankers' coup, the business plot, or the Wall Street Putsch, for those keen on German history. See, Hitler's initial movement of power, where he turned the tides of Germany in his favor, was referred to as the Beer Hall Putsch, or the Munich Putsch of 1923, which was a failed coup by Hitler at the time, but cemented the strong foundation of support he would need just a decade later to seize control of the nation and all of Europe. The hero of America's Wall Street Putsch? One of the very men recruited to usurp the White House. Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler. Butler was not only one of the most honored and decorated war generals of the early 20th century, but he was also an American patriot, a real patriot. He valued America's Constitution and found the idea of overthrowing the government appalling. The general had a choice. He could lead the coup as asked, rise to power, or he could rat on them. Before the plot could even be fully planned, he chose the latter. In 1934, General Butler testified to a committee that would be compared to our current House Un-American Activities Committee that he was approached by several individuals with a plot to overthrow the United States government and install a fascist authoritarian regime, similar to what was happening in Germany, where the people were more forced to work their jobs, know their roles, and support industry without all the silly complaining. Roosevelt's New Deal shifted power not to the people, mind you. It gave the illusion of empowering the American working class, when in reality it simply provided opportunities the business sector should have provided with all those profits. What the New Deal did was shift power from the wealthy business sector to the federal government. And many did not like that. Some of those, Singer sewing machine heir Robert Sterling Clark, elite businessman Grayson M.P. Murphy, both accused of financially funding the attempted coup, along with Wall Street broker William Doyle, decided something needed to be done. Using their intermediary, banker, investor, and businessman Gerald C. McGuire, they reached out to General Butler, whom they identified as potentially being sympathetic to their cause. They asked him to more or less assemble an army of disenfranchised veterans that would execute a meticulously planned action against America to overthrow our government. These men were figureheads of a much larger movement and plot. The names these four men represented have gone unlisted, brushed aside in history books. This event, a barely mentioned footnote of almost history. However, it's relevant to look back at the titans of industry of the early 20th century that continued to provide support in various ways to the Nazi movement, and you'll see that fascism was alive and well, thriving in fact, during this era in America. Remember, we the people didn't find out about many of the atrocities of the early parts of the war until much later. All we had were newspapers and all those propaganda reels at the front of the cinema, for those who could afford to go. It's also important to note that, in the true tradition of American history, no criminal charges were filed. No one was hanged. These men were allowed to go about living their very privileged, fascist, and corrupt lives. The McCormack-Dickstein Committee's investigation into this event would be comparable to the modern investigation into Russian interference into our recent elections. Watered down, downplayed, nothing to see here. Not even slaps on the wrist. Those rich, powerful elite scurried under the fridge for another few decades, like the cockroaches they are. Are in parentheses. So why are you just now hearing about a plot that took place in the early 1930s? For many in historical academia, this event is not technically regarded as a coup or even an attempted coup. Technically, that is correct. Before it got to the concrete planning stages, the plot was exposed by the good General Butler, a man who was vocally anti-war and understood all too well the costs of such actions. It flopped before it took flight. Imagine this in modern context, as if the January 6th insurrection never actually happened. The storming of the Capitol, I'm talking about. Instead, someone came forward, told authorities about the plot to enrage uneducated, mouth-breathing inbreds to storm the U.S. Capitol with the intent to hang the Vice President and Speaker of the House. More, if they could get away with it. Imagine if the entire protest outside the Capitol that day had been dispersed before it raged into a full-on riot. Then, 2 years later, sitting before Congress, the whistleblower named names and told of the would-be plot to storm the Capitol. Sounds insane, right? Like, we would still consider that enough of a warning sign to take some action, right? Like, we wouldn't just sit there and hear that Americans plotted an action against our government, and just because one person happened to rat them out, we just let it all go because, after all, it didn't happen. It almost happened, but it didn't happen, right? Well, America is letting the insurrection go just like that, and we will pay for that for decades to come. Because what happened as a result of this unsuccessful coup, the business plot, or Wall Street Putsch, was the subsequent slow degradation of workers' rights in America, the destabilization of our economy, the dismantling of our labor unions, the unraveling of our pro-labor policies and legislation, the rise of right-to-work states and other legislation that strips we the people of any protections and guarantees more rights for the corporations than for those who make up that corporation. And of course, Citizens United. You see, the business plot, the Wall Street Putsch, didn't happen, but it was successful. For those elite wealthy, those of the inherited generational wealth, the plots and the games they play are the long ones. For America and we the people, we're just trying to scrape by paycheck to paycheck, as we always have, hoping Congress can agree every few months on a new budget, spending bill, or whatever to prevent the shutdown of the federal government. Something. Anything. That's a playbook Republicans have played for well over a century. You see, they want to prove that America doesn't work and will only work with an authoritarian fascist regime at the top, when in fact what doesn't work and never has worked in America is capitalism. It's failed over and over, and the only time it's been successful is for the ultra-wealthy elite. The rest of us have to gamble on the lottery or the stock market. What's the difference? There is no hard work and you'll get ahead anymore. This generation of workers is realizing quickly this harsh truth. They aren't going to put up with the things previous generations did, and they will be derided as lazy and entitled for it when maybe we were the generations of gullibility to believe we had a chance. Why do they want to convince us democracy doesn't work? Because as we the people slowly surrender our rights and freedoms, it becomes easier and easier for fascism to take hold. Normalized abnormalities become just the way it is. What are you going to do after all? The thing that doesn't work about American capitalism is what we discovered 160 years ago, and it's what I discussed at the beginning of this episode. America's economy is dependent on slavery. The minimum wage is not only a guaranteed required minimum amount an hour of your time is worth, according to the federal government, it is what it costs a company every hour you're there. Raising that pisses greedy people off. Eliminating that pisses the poors off. Keeping it the same? That's just the way it is. What are you going to do after all? They know that slavery is the only way our system works. Most of us have to work for free or for unlivably low wages for our system to work. Apprenticeships, internships, and paying your dues while not paying your bills. The problem is, if businesses are forced to pay livable wages for their area, most businesses couldn't survive. And it's easy to say, well, that business shouldn't survive and shouldn't have opened if they couldn't pay people a livable wage. But unfortunately, our economy is far more complex than that. Plus, shut all those businesses down and imagine the economic blowback. Unemployment. People were making a few $100s a week, are now making nothing, and lots of people make nothing. 0% of zero is zero. And income taxes need an income to tax. America's economy cannot support the livable wage, and we've known that since slavery was abolished. We've seen the ebbs and flows, ups and downs. And one thing is certain, those 1% wealthy elite think that slashing the payroll is the fastest way to profit. You, America, we the people, are the payroll. The reality is this event very much did happen, but its significance on history debated and diminished. Was this an actual coup? Failed coup? Attempted coup? How do you categorize this event through the lens of historical perspective? You debate that all you want. The real issue here is that nothing has changed. That attempted coup was just a lesson learned. If you want a fascist regime to take hold in America, you've got to get the fascists elected. And that is exactly what those conspirators of the 1930s Wall Street putsch in America did over the next century. But for that larger long-game plot to take hold, they would need a people willing to accept it. They would need the dumbing down and numbing down of America, disguised as for entertainment purposes only. And who better to lead that coup than America's reality TV presidential candidate? Coming up, while we're deconstructing some of America's 20th century crossing of the ideological streams, let's talk about America's unhealthiest cultural quests for perfection. In Eugene Ick, I'm looking at this country's twisted fascination with and warped justifications for eugenics. We most closely associate that phrase with Adolf Hitler's obsession with blonde-haired, blue-eyed European Aryans, but in fact, those ideas, attitudes, and values are rooted in our own culture and are reinforced by our entertainment media. It's in the genes, they say. While I'm talking about the deliberate attempt to control what it is and what's in those genes, I'm peeling back the curtain on the things we just don't say out loud and putting into perspective that our own compromised self-image makes it easier to look down on others. From tweaking the DNA of an embryo to arranged marriages, test tube babies, and pretty grandbabies, we've opened ourselves up to debates on genetically modified people, even to the point of, if we can eliminate a condition, shouldn't we? Which sounds great when it's an inherited disease like Crohn's, but becomes scary as hell when it's something more superficial. We'll also discuss genetics, the rise in DNA testing technology, and our fascination with family tree genetics, and find out more about America's dirty little secret, the quest for perfection and the obsession over eugenics, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultists. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, the Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook, is available on Amazon. And you can link through that through my website at joshbrandonmedia.com. Influence by Josh Brandon is also on Amazon, is for anyone who wants to be more on social media and grow your social media accounts. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find all my original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, and clips of my acting and voiceover work organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out all my merch in my merch store, the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store, and get your trigger tees and bumper stickers and new merch coming soon. We got more products on the way very soon. Follow me everywhere you can on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel and do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. And if you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App. This is my job. Don't forget to sign up for my email list at joshbrandonmedia.com. Hey, I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.